Welcome back, deep divers. Ready for another wild ride?
Buckle up because this one's a doozy.
Today, we're tackling the captivating, yet controversial, Yeonmi Park, a North Korean defector who's really captured the world's attention with her story.
Yeah, I mean, best-selling books, speaking engagements all over, massive online following. She's painted a pretty striking picture of life under Kim Jong-un's regime, but
But, of course, there's a but. As she's become more famous, more and more questions about her story have popped up.
definitely. And that leads us to the big question we're digging into today. Is Yeonmi Park a legitimate voice for human rights, or is there something else going on? Is she more interested in fame and fortune?
Grifter or gifted? It's the age-old question, right?
Right, and to get to the bottom of it, we're diving deep into all the stuff you send us, articles, interviews, research, even some social media posts. We're leaving no stone unturned.
We're going to look at the inconsistencies, how her story has evolved, and try to figure out what's motivating her words and actions.
Exactly, no pulling punches here.
Absolutely not. We're going to look at the evidence that supports her story, the evidence that challenges it, and try to give you a balanced perspective so you can decide for yourself. Grifter or gifted?
Sounds good to me. Where do we even begin with someone like this?
Well, I think the best place to start is at the beginning, right? Her early life in North Korea, which she says was full of unimaginable hardship. But even that part of her story has some, shall we say, interesting elements.
Yeah, some of the sources paint a picture that doesn't quite fit the stereotype we often have of North Korea. She describes a somewhat, well, privileged upbringing, at least at first.
Privileged in North Korea. Okay, I'm intrigued.
Right, so in North Korea, they have this thing called songbun, which is like a social ranking system, almost like a caste system. And her grandfather was a military officer, which gave the family certain advantages.
So not exactly the image of desperate poverty we usually associate with North Korea.
Exactly. But then she says things changed drastically when her uncle was imprisoned. That caused their social standing to plummet, and then boom, the famine of the 1990s hit. The Arduous March, they called it.
That was a horrific time. Mass starvation, incredible suffering. She's talked about seeing dead bodies in the street, people eating grass to survive, families torn apart.
Right, and she contrasts those stories with descriptions of a pretty normal childhood before the famine, playing video games, not really paying attention to the regime's propaganda. It's like she's saying the famine was this huge turning point that split her life in two.
So a before and after kind of thing. Interesting.
Totally. But here's where we hit one of the first inconsistencies that makes you go,
Lay it on me.
Her own mother, who escaped with her, has actually contradicted some of Yeonmi's claims about their experiences during the famine.
Wait, really? Her own mother?
Yep. On a South Korean TV show, she said they weren't actually starving as badly as Yeonmi described. She said, and I quote, "We weren't that bad off, and we weren't that poor."
Whoa. That's a pretty big difference. So if they weren't on the verge of starvation, why'd they risk everything to escape?
Well, according to Yeonmi, her father was imprisoned for illegal trading, leaving her and her sister to fend for themselves.
So that's what prompted the escape to China.
Exactly. And that's where her story takes an even more dramatic turn.
More dramatic. Okay, now I really want to hear this.
She says they were trafficked and that she witnessed her mother being sexually assaulted.
Oh my gosh, that's horrible.
Right. It's really disturbing stuff. And those details are definitely part of what's made people so sympathetic to her. She even claims her mother offered herself up to be raped to protect Yeonmi.
I don't even know what to say to that. But, and maybe this is important to point out, have those claims been independently verified?
That's a great question, and the answer is no, not really. And then there's another inconsistency.
Another one. Okay, I'm starting to see a pattern here.
Yeah, so she says her father eventually died in China, and she had to bury his ashes on a mountainside at midnight. But another account, she said they had to move his body secretly because they were afraid of getting caught by the Chinese authorities.
So the details keep changing. Is it just a fuzzy memory, or is there something more deliberate going on?
That's the million-dollar question. And it's one we need to keep in mind as we go further down the rabbit hole of Yeonmi's story. Because as her fame has grown, those inconsistencies and questions just keep multiplying.
It's like a soap opera.
Yeah.
What happens next?
Well, next we get to her arrival in South Korea and her meteoric rise to fame. And that, my friend, is where things get really interesting in terms of understanding her motivations.
Okay, I'm hooked. Let's get into it.
So Yeonmi gets to South Korea and boom, instant celebrity. Talk shows, interviews, the whole 9 yards. You really start to see her public persona developing at this point.
It's wild how quickly she became this media sensation, not just some quiet refugee rebuilding her life. It's like she was launched into the spotlight.
Totally. And there's this one early appearance that really got people talking. She was on a South Korean variety show called Now on My Way to Meet You.
Hmm, I've never heard of that one.
It featured, well, young, attractive female defectors, and it got a lot of flack for, shall we say, exaggerating and maybe even fabricating things about North Korea to spice things up for the audience.
Defector beauties.
Yeah.
Seriously, that just sounds exploitative. I mean, what does it do to these women's stories when they're presented that way?
Yeah, a lot of people were really uncomfortable with it. They said it basically turned these women's complex experiences into cheap entertainment, playing into this whole voyeuristic fascination with North Korea, and maybe even harming the credibility of other defector stories.
Yikes. And Yeonmi was a star on this show, so this is like her first taste of fame.
Oh yeah, she was a huge hit. She even got nicknamed the Paris Hilton of North Korea because of her style and her captivating storytelling. This is where she starts to get that taste of fame, which some people think might have influenced her later on.
I mean, if you're in that environment where the more dramatic your story is, the more attention you get, it makes you wonder if that starts to shape how you tell that story.
For sure. But even in South Korea, some cracks start to show in her story.
Really? What do you mean?
Other North Korean defectors started voicing their concerns about how accurate her accounts were. They said some of her descriptions of life in North Korea just didn't add up, weren't possible.
So they were calling her out. What were they saying specifically?
Well, for example, she talked about witnessing public executions in stadiums, including one where a friend's mother was killed for watching a Hollywood movie.
A public execution for watching a movie. That's intense.
Right. But other defectors from her hometown said those kinds of public executions in stadiums just never happened there.
Okay, that's a pretty big discrepancy. What did she say about that?
She said the inconsistencies were because of the trauma she experienced, that maybe her memories were jumbled or distorted. Which brings up a really important question. How much can we rely on someone's personal memories, especially when they're talking about really traumatic events?
Trauma and memory, that's a whole can of worms right there. I mean, trauma definitely affects how we remember things, but it also makes it harder to tell what's a genuine memory lapse and what might be something more intentional, you know? And the stakes are even higher when those stories are shaping public opinion and even policy decisions.
Absolutely. And then we get to another big turning point in Yeonmi's story, her move to the United States and her, let's say, entry into American politics.
This is where she really starts to get attention for her, shall we say, strong opinions, especially her criticisms of woke culture and all that. And she really aligns herself with some pretty conservative figures and organizations.
Right. She becomes a regular on those conservative media platforms, PragerU, Turning Point USA, you know, the ones. And those views definitely resonate with a certain segment of the population. But this shift in focus, I mean, it really alienates a lot of her earlier supporters who saw her as more of a human rights advocate.
Some people were saying she's just exercising her freedom of speech, fair enough. But others were like, wait, is this a calculated move to tap into a new audience and boost her career?
Yeah, it's hard to say for sure what her motivations were. It's definitely open to interpretation.
It's like, is she genuinely passionate about these issues, or is this all just part of a bigger strategy?
Right. And then there's her YouTube channel. She's got a huge following there.
Oh, yeah, I've seen some of her videos. Pretty slick production value, too.
Yeah, and her content there has totally shifted. It's gone from raising awareness about North Korea to all sorts of different topics, and a lot of it leans pretty heavily into conservative talking points.
And that online presence has definitely become a big source of income for her, right?
Oh yeah, she's monetized it big time. Merchandise, product promotions, ad revenue. She's making bank. Which raises the question, is she using her story and platform to advocate for the causes she believes in, or is she mainly in it for the money?
That's the tough part, isn't it? It's hard to separate those things sometimes. On the one hand, she's built a successful career. Good for her, right? But then there's the question of whether she's exploiting her trauma for financial gain and aligning herself with a political ideology that a lot of people find really harmful.
And that leads us back to that core question, that grifter versus gifted dilemma. What are the ethics of profiting from a story about suffering, especially when you're using that story to push a political agenda?
That's a tough one. There are no easy answers there. I guess it's up to each of us to decide where we stand on that. So here we are, deep divers, after a deep dive into the fascinating and, let's be honest, kind of messy story of Yeonmi Park. This woman who's captured hearts with her tales of escaping North Korea. But she's also sparked a ton of debate about how true her story really is, how it's changed over time, and what her real goals are.
Right. We've seen how some of the details in her accounts have shifted, how those shifts seem to happen as her platform and influence grow, and how she's moved away from just focusing on human rights to aligning herself with a very specific political viewpoint.
So what's the verdict? Is Yeonmi Park a master manipulator who's figured out how to spin a good yarn for her own benefit? Or is she a gifted storyteller whose experiences, even if they're exaggerated, still expose the horrors of a brutal regime?
It's not a simple answer, that's for sure. In the end, each listener has to weigh the evidence and decide for themselves what they believe.
One thing that really strikes me is how her story taps into our, I don't know, our cultural obsession with North Korea. It's this closed off, secretive place. It's like a breeding ground for speculation and sensationalism.
Yeah, totally. And Yeonmi's story, with all the talk of starvation and public executions and daring escapes, it feeds right into those existing narratives. It's a story that sells, books, interviews, clicks.
But here's the problem. When a story gets so tangled up with our own preconceived ideas and our desire to be entertained, it becomes hard to separate fact from fiction.
Exactly. And that's where the ethics of it all come in. If parts of her story are made up or stretched, is she exploiting our fascination with North Korea to make a buck? And if so, what does that mean for other North Korean defectors? Will people start to doubt their stories too?
It's complicated, right? It makes you think about the responsibility of people who've been through trauma, especially when they share their stories publicly. They have to make sure their narratives are accurate and authentic.
And it highlights the responsibility we all have as media consumers to be critical thinkers, to look for different perspectives, to be wary of stories that seem too good to be true or that fit too neatly into our own biases.
I think the power dynamics here are interesting too. Yeonmi Park is a young, attractive woman, and she's really good at navigating the media and using her story to make a big impact.
For sure. Her image and the way she presents herself have definitely contributed to her success, which begs the question, do we believe stories more readily if they're told by someone who fits a certain mold? Someone who's charismatic and relatable?
Makes you think, right? Are we all just a little bit more susceptible to manipulation because of that?
It's worth considering, absolutely. We gotta be aware of our own biases and how they might be influencing us, even when we're just listening to someone's story.
So after this deep dive into Yeonmi Park's life, I have to admit I'm left with more questions than answers. But I think that's okay.
I agree. The point isn't to decide once and for all if she's a grifter or a gifted storyteller. It's about engaging with her story thoughtfully, considering the context, and accepting that it's complicated.
It's about using this whole case as a way to look at how we interact with information, our own biases, and the role we play in spreading or challenging the stories we hear.
In a world where charisma and controversy are often intertwined, we need to be sharp, to be critical thinkers, to be careful about the information we consume, and to have these tough conversations with nuance and a little bit of empathy.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it's made you curious and encouraged you to think a little more deeply about the stories that shape our view of the world.